The porch light clicked off with a sound so small it should not have mattered, and yet, for Jack Coleman, standing in the driveway with rain hammering down on his shoulders and his 6-year-old daughter's hand trembling inside his own, that tiny click felt louder than any explosion he had ever survived overseas. He stood there for one full second, just one, staring at the darkened windows of the Whitfield mansion, at the house where his children had slept for 2 years, at the place where he had swallowed his pride nightly just to keep a roof over their heads. And he understood, with the clarity that only comes in the worst moments of a man's life, that the door behind him was never opening again. Thunder cracked across the Virginia hills as his son, Ethan, 8 years old and trying so hard to look unafraid that his jaw had begun to ache from clenching it, gripped tight to the leash of a soaked German shepherd named Duke, the same dog who had once dragged Jack out from under a collapsed wall in Kandahar with his teeth locked onto a torn strap of gear, refusing to let go even as the ceiling came down around them both. Now Duke stood shivering in a Virginia driveway, water running off his fur in sheets, because 2 grieving grandparents could not forgive a man for loving their daughter more than her inheritance. Jack did not look back at the house. He could not allow himself to. If he turned around, he was certain he would see Eleanor Whitfield's face in the window, and he did not think his heart could survive seeing it twice in one night. The way her voice had cracked into something that sounded almost like grief, but landed like a blade, telling him that Sarah would still be alive if she had married a man with sense instead of a man with dog tags. He loaded Grace into the old Ford pickup first, then Ethan, then Duke into the truck bed with a blanket Jack had thrown over him, and only when the doors were shut and the children could not see his face did Jack Coleman allow one single tear to fall, quickly wiped away, buried the way he had buried so much else. 2 years before that rainy driveway, Jack had been a United States Navy SEAL, 18 years of service behind him, a man who had knelt beside dying friends in places most Americans would never be able to find on a map, a man who had always believed that surviving war was the hardest thing life would ever demand of him. He met Sarah Whitfield at a fundraiser he had not wanted to attend, a woman with old money and a heart soft enough to see past his silence, and she fell in love not with his rank or his medals, but with the quiet way he listened, the way his eyes softened when he laughed, the way he came home from deployments broken in places no one else could see, and let her be the one who slowly, patiently put him back together. They built a small life on a modest street, a house with a crooked mailbox, and a garden Sarah never quite mastered. 2 children born 11 months apart, a family that Jack considered richer than anything her parents' money could ever buy. Then came the night Sarah collapsed in their kitchen, an aneurysm no doctor had seen coming, and Jack found himself a widower at 39, kneeling on cold tile with his wife's hand going still in his, whispering her name over and over as though repetition alone could call her back. He remembered, even now, the particular silence of that kitchen afterward, the dripping faucet, the smell of the dinner she had been cooking left forgotten on the stove, a silence he would carry inside his chest for the rest of his life. In the raw months that followed, Robert and Eleanor Whitfield, who had never once approved of their daughter's husband, offered Jack and the children a place in their estate, not out of love, Jack would later understand, but out of a quiet belief that proximity would eventually break him, that watching him struggle would prove what they had always suspected, that he could not give their grandchildren the life they deserved. Jack accepted only because grief had hollowed him out, because he was working double shifts at a security firm and drowning in a way no training had prepared him for, because he had promised Sarah in that kitchen, in her final breath, that their children would never once doubt they were loved. But life beneath the Whitfield roof came wrapped in small, constant cruelties. Comments about his modest paycheck dropped casually over dinner. Comments about private schools and trust funds the children would never see. Until the night 8-year-old Ethan overheard his grandmother telling a guest that his father was nothing but a broken soldier living off their charity. And the boy, in a flash of innocent fury Jack would later be quietly proud of, shouted at his grandmother to stop being cruel to his dad. Robert Whitfield told Jack afterward, in a tone colder than the storm that would come only weeks later, that respect went in both directions under his roof, and if Jack could not control his own son, perhaps he could not control anything at all. And so, on a night in early spring, with rain falling like judgment from a merciless sky, Jack Coleman found himself loading his children and his dog into a truck with $400 to his name and nowhere in the world to go. The weeks that followed tested him in ways war never had. They lived out of a budget motel off Route 9, thin walls, flickering light above the bathroom mirror, and Jack slept sitting upright in the room's only chair so that Ethan and Grace could share the bed, while Duke curled at the foot of the mattress every single night, alert even in sleep, as though some old instinct told him this family needed guarding now more than it ever had overseas. Jack worked every shift he could find, sometimes 2 jobs in a single day, coming home with his hands raw and his back aching. And more nights than he could count, he slid his own dinner quietly onto his children's plates when he thought they weren't watching, telling them he had already eaten at work, telling them the small, merciful lies fathers tell when truth is too heavy for young shoulders. Grace, only 6, carried everywhere a small stuffed rabbit that had belonged to her mother since girlhood, its ear worn thin from decades of small hands, and she would whisper to it at night the way other children whispered to imaginary friends, and Jack would watch her from across the dim room, his chest aching with a grief he could never release, because every time he looked at his daughter, he saw Sarah's same steady eyes staring back at him. Ethan, meanwhile, tried to be strong the way boys believe they must be, insisting he wasn't scared, insisting he could get a paper route to help with the bills, insisting the Duke would protect them no matter what. And one night, when the boy finally broke down and admitted in a whisper that he missed his room, missed his old bed, missed things being
simple, Jack pulled him close and said the only thing he had left to offer, that real courage was never about the absence of fear, it was about getting up anyway. A lesson his own SEAL instructors had once taught him in a very different kind of darkness. There were nights Jack sat outside the motel room long after his children were asleep, staring up at a sky offering no answers, wondering if he had failed Sarah, wondering if this was how the story ended for a man who had given everything to his country and had nothing left to give his own family. And it was in one of those quiet, breaking moments that Duke would rise, walk to him, and press his cold nose into Jack's open palm, a small, wordless act of loyalty that reminded him he was not entirely alone in the dark. It was on one such evening, 3 streets from the motel, that Duke slipped his leash while Jack stepped inside a gas station to count out change for gas, and by the time Jack came running back out into the parking lot calling his name, the dog was gone, vanished into the gray dusk, chasing some scent or sound or instinct that Jack would never fully understand until much later. Nearly 300 miles away, in a modest law office in Charlottesville, an aging attorney named Walter Higgins had spent the better part of a year trying to locate the rightful heir to an estate left behind by a reclusive investor named Thomas Ashford, a man who, unknown to nearly everyone, had been Sarah's biological uncle, estranged from the Whitfield side of the family over a decades-old dispute, so old even they had nearly forgotten its origin. Ashford had died without immediate family, leaving behind nearly $200 million and a will naming his only living blood relative, a niece named Sarah Whitfield Coleman, as sole heir, unaware that Sarah had passed away, which under the terms of the will meant the fortune would transfer directly to her surviving children. Walter had exhausted every lead, every outdated address, every attempt to reach a Whitfield family, too proud to mention an uncle they had cut off years earlier, and he had begun to fear the money would sit frozen in probate court indefinitely, the children growing up never knowing what bloodline they carried, when on a gray Tuesday afternoon, a large, exhausted German shepherd wandered into the parking lot outside his office, nose low to the pavement, tail low with fatigue, having followed some invisible thread across 3 miles of unfamiliar streets. Walter, an old dog lover himself, knelt down carefully, expecting only to find a lost pet's home address, and when he turned over the worn collar tag, he found no address at all, only a phrase engraved there years earlier as a private joke between Sarah and Jack, Coleman family protector, and beneath it, faint but legible, a phone number Jack had simply never thought to update. Walter's hands went still. He had read the name Coleman 100 times across a year of frustrated searching, in Sarah's old records, in Ashford's file, in documents that had led nowhere for months. He dialed the number with fingers that were not quite steady, and when Jack answered from the gas station parking lot, breathless, frantic, still calling his dog's name into the dark, Walter asked him
gently if his late wife's name had been Sarah Whitfield. There was a long silence on the line before Jack managed to say yes. Walter told him in the careful voice of a man who had delivered difficult news many times, but never news quite like this, that he needed to sit down, though Jack was already sitting on the curb with rain beginning to fall again, and that there was something about an inheritance Jack needed to hear, something that would take days to fully settle into a mind so exhausted by simple survival. Jack drove through the night to Charlottesville, Ethan and Grace asleep in the back seat, Duke resting his big head against Jack's shoulder from the passenger seat, as though he understood that whatever waited ahead mattered more than anything that had come before. The next morning, in Walter's small office, lined with law books, papers spread carefully across the desk, Walter explained that Jack's children were heirs to nearly $200 million, and Jack Coleman, a man who had once carried wounded brothers through gunfire without his hands shaking, felt his whole body begin to tremble, felt the room tilt slightly, felt Grace's small hand slip into his own without her fully understanding why her father's eyes had filled with tears. He did not weep from joy alone. He wept from the sheer accumulated weight of everything it had taken to reach that chair. The motel nights, the skipped dinners, the parking lot search for a missing dog that had somehow, impossibly saved them all. Word traveled quickly through small towns, as it always does, and within days the Whitfields appeared outside the motel room door with careful smiles and rehearsed apologies, Eleanor reaching for Grace as though nothing had happened, Robert offering Jack a handshake and talk of moving the family back to the estate, their sudden warmth as transparent as glass in sunlight. Jack stood in the doorway, his children behind him, Duke pressed against his leg, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, remembering the rain, the slammed door, the nights his children had gone to sleep, not knowing if tomorrow would be any kinder than today. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, quiet, the voice of a man who had already survived the worst life could offer him. He told them forgiveness was something he could give because bitterness was a weight he refused to hand down to his children, but that trust was something else entirely, something earned slowly through years and patience and consistency, not purchased with an apology spoken only after money entered the picture. Robert Whitfield nodded slowly, something shifting behind his eyes that might have been shame, and Eleanor wept, not the practiced tears Jack had seen so many times before, but something raw, something that looked for the first time like real regret finally breaking through pride grown old and brittle. The healing that followed was not immediate, and it was not easy. It came in small pieces across many months, a birthday visit here, a quiet Sunday dinner there, Eleanor slowly learning to braid Grace's hair the way Sarah once had, while Grace kept her mother's old stuffed rabbit tucked in her lap the whole time, its worn ear brushing against Eleanor's hand, and Eleanor touching it once, gently, whispering that Sarah had carried that rabbit everywhere for years.